All right, guys. So, for those of you that know my story, you know that I made a failed attempt at trying to do philosophy professionally, but it didn't mean that I stopped thinking about, philosophical stuff and reading about it and having that stuff bounce around in my head. And one of the things that I have found in the recent past during this lockdown period is that, both in terms of like me thinking about my own situation and then kind of the things that I've been attracted to when it comes to like reading or podcasts, YouTube stuff. I've had this idea of like the way we think, why we think what we think, how we know what we're thinking about, how we know what we're thinking is reliable. I've had that topic, that idea of epistemology, on my mind. So one of the things that I thought was that two guys who I've had some really fun, meaty conversations with on kind of like epistemological and heuristic stuff are Donnelley and Daniel Teater. And so I thought, well, why don't I get those guys on a call with me and we can have one of those conversations in front of some people and see if it's fun and worth listening to. So thank you guys very much for joining me and for being willing to do this.
Absolutely.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Absolutely. So one of the things that I was curious to ask you guys about, and this relates to the whole, thinking about how you think topic, or I'll try to make it relate to that. But one of the things that I've noticed in myself and also in some other people that I know is that, our external circumstances got changed on us, right? Can't go to work, can't go to the grocery store without permission. If you go, you got to put a mask on, and you see someone you don't have a mask on, they're going to make you feel guilty about it, all that kind of stuff. So with those kind of like external changes, I started doing some things that I hadn't done before. Like one of them is starting to create content like this. It's something that I had been interested in trying to do, but I hadn't really pulled the trigger on it. So some of that's just a function of having more time, but I also think it's because the external change in the circumstances changed the way that I was thinking about myself and the way that I spend time and navigate my life. I know that, and you guys have each had a little bit of that too, where you've kind of started doing some new things. But what do you, have you observed that same thing? Have you had that same experience? What do you think about that idea of like the new thing happening during the lockdown?
You want to take it first?
Yeah. So what I thought was really interesting, I think my experience was similar to a lot of the folks that I spoke to, is that initially when COVID hit, the first reaction from everyone with all this time shift was to rest. Like the whole busy excuse was no longer applicable to 95% of people, that maybe less, that you talk to, where the let's say system one response to someone asking, "How have you been?" is, "Oh, I've been busy." That could no longer be an excuse. And a lot of people I talk to would just say, "Well, I've got all this free time. I slept in a little bit longer than I usually did," or "It's been nice. I had dinner with my family a few nights in a row." Then there was this phase of, okay, now what? I have this time. How do I structure it? What I determined to do out of that was a few different things. I was just kind of compartmentalizing the important areas of my life. So one, I didn't really read or pray very often, consistently at least. So I decided to make a habit of that. Decided to do pull-ups every time I crossed my kitchen door. I have a pull-up bar there. So I just said, I started with 5 and kind of gradually went up from there. And then I decided to write as well. So I'd always been telling myself that I wanted to start putting my thoughts into writing just to make me learn more. I've always found it more helpful to really cement what you learn by writing it and showing it to other people. So I started a newsletter with zero desire to have a bunch of followers or readers. Really the main concern is so I can actually spend this newfound time, this rearranged time, by actually learning something and proving that I learned it instead of letting it kind of like go to the wayside, that thing that you learned a long time ago that you don't remember anymore. So, and then lastly, I am not a good cook, but I we have a new baby at home who was born, a week before lockdown. So I'm trying to be better at cooking and in search of the perfect burger. And at this point, I think it's butter basted on a iron skillet. I think that's the solution, but we can debate about that in another video call.
Yeah. We can determine how we know what we know when it relates to burgers, and how will we determine that? I'm in. I think I think about it in terms of several lenses. For myself personally, I've definitely started something new. It was a bit of a convergence for me. I've basically started on a house renovation. Totally was not the plan going into COVID, shelter in place, but series of circumstances led to just being the right time. Mainly my father-in-law, who's in construction, is available, and he was like, "Hey, I'm available now for many months. So if you would like to start, I'm ready." And so they're living here with us, and it's been a madhouse, a bit of a madhouse. But I think even beyond that, I would say, as I think about COVID, as I think about I like to think about a little mental awareness librarian in our brains, and in the prefrontal cortex, just kind of like chilling out, hanging, and like figuring out and kind of directing all the incoming stimuli. The problem is he does not have capacity to manage everything. Therefore, he automates like a ton of stuff. So we got file folders of automated stuff and data that he doesn't have to think about. And so it's like he doesn't have to think about what he's thinking about. And the problem is when COVID hit, it took all the file folders and dumped them on his desk. And now he's got to think about what he's thinking about. And the poor librarian, I've checked in with him a couple times. He's smoking cigarettes now. He's really struggling. He's on all the caffeine that he can get on, because he's overwhelmed by stimuli. He cannot keep up. And so there's a sense in which it's like, whoa, how do I now make sense of my new reality? And it's almost like a relearning. And so I'm guessing a lot of folks have had to relearn what is and how to construct what they know to be around them. And that's painful, because you're actually grieving and losing something really central to how you know yourself. Yeah. And you don't even recognize it because it just happened. And so anyway, I say absolutely, I agree with you. I think that people are probably entering into all sorts of new and different kinds of ways of experiencing themselves and their external world as a result of the changes.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny. So, Lucas specifically like overtly mentioned the System 1 idea, and then the librarian that you're describing, Daniel. So that's, Lucas and I have talked about this book, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, who's a Nobel Prize winning philosopher, economist guy. And he talks about, System 1, System 2 thinking. And the System 1 is kind of like that, you don't have to think about what you think. Like you said, Daniel, it's the stuff that you just know because you know it. You don't have to go, you don't have to be like, well, before I blink, let me think through, like how often my eyeballs need to be wetted and what,
right.
pathways need to be activated for my, the nerves in my eyelids to get the signals they need. You just do it,
Yep.
That's System 1. And then System 2 is whenever you do have to kind of like think a little bit more. So whenever you have situations that are, that don't neatly fit into the mental model that you've already got, in your, loaded in your brain. And I think that's exactly kind of what's happened, is that so much of our life that's kind of like, pre-programmed in a sense, and even if it's not like pre-programmed in a super rigid sort of a way, but just your normal routines, all of a sudden those are all gone. And so, so like you said, it's like the file folders are on the table and you're like, okay, how do I make sense of this? And, and I think that's also part of what, has made this such an anxious time, because, there's a lot about that System 2 thinking that your body resists, because it takes a lot of energy. It's scary because it's uncertain. And so like, obviously I was having this conversation with somebody a couple of days ago. Obviously, like there's stuff to be anxious about right now, what's going to happen to my 401k? What's going to happen? Will the economy, totally get torpedoed by all of this. Is everyone I know going to get sick? How many people do I know will die? But now we're kind of getting to the point where some of those sorts of things, we don't have like total resolution, but we're getting some sense of how bad, the virus will actually be, what the economical impact will actually be. But there's still, my perception in myself and the people I talk to is there's still a lot of anxiety. And I think it's because there's some of it, at least, it's because of that, because we can't lean on that, like the mental models as much as we're accustomed to. And it's an interesting thing, So you thought a lot about the mental model idea, Lucas. I mean, like, does that make sense what I'm saying? Like, would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, I think to combine both of those thoughts, it's like what Daniel was saying, you have this automation that your life is on. You don't really realize that it's automated because the decision comes like that because it's automated. But I think it's possible to rewire those things. And again, with system two thinking, it takes time for you to go through that and say, wait, why do I do it this way? Why is this a habit that I've developed over the last several years? Or why is this a feeling that I always feel when this happens? And it's possible to generate mental models, which is literally just a tool for how you think about the world. And people from Solomon in the Bible to Charlie Munger, an investor, Warren Buffett's partner at Berkshire Hathaway, have mental models. Whether you know it or not, they have principles that they say, this is how I see the world. And you can either choose to use those to your benefit, or to go about your life kind of either putting everything on automate aimlessly, or creating your own models. And that's a big piece of the time that I've been spending, during the crisis, not being able to go anywhere, is just rethink my mental models and learn new ones. And I've been reading a couple books. One is just a summary of mental models, The Great Mental Models by Shane Parrish. Some of them I believe very heavily. I don't think there are many ways to refute. And some of them I kind of said, this doesn't ring true to me. But at least taking the time to evaluate those things and say, like, how do I want to be different after this time? It's made me think a ton. I don't know, in my circle, at least, there's this phrase lifestyle design that maybe you've heard before. I think a lot of people are rethinking their lifestyle design, how much and when they work, and where they work, and how they spend time with their family, how much time they spend with their family, and what they do when they're doing that. And I think, a lot of people have spent a lot less money eating out and buying things. Maybe some people have bought more things via Amazon or Shopify, whatever. But people are saying, maybe I can live a little differently. They've got a bunch of time on their hands to think, like, maybe I can do this a little differently than I did before. And I've certainly had a lot of those thoughts going on. So it's just a interesting dynamic at play.
Yeah, and I think about when you were talking about mental models coming at it from a slightly different angle. One psychologist, he talks about how aware of what I'm aware that I'm like, how aware of what I'm paying attention to am I? So how aware of what I'm focusing on and what my attention is drawn to am I? Because it's a way, in some ways, of starting to get curious and become more clueful as to what my mental models might actually be. It's because where your awareness, often our awareness is just driven by the reactive, by the automatic. But as we slow down and we start doing, and it kind of inviting a different way of engaging what's happening, it puts us in contact with our mental models. It puts us in contact with, oh, wow, I've reacted very strongly in a certain way. Oh, that's because I have a mental model. It's because I've actually made meaning, assigned something about what's happening. Even if it's done in a split second, it's happening. And so I think that in the slowed down spaces, we all of a sudden have these moments where we can have like cracks into some of those mental models. It's like, one of my favorite authors, Henry Nouwen, talks about the importance of silence and solitude and how it actually exposes us. It reveals us in ways that are quite unsettling. When we enter into these slowed down spaces, we suddenly realize, oh, my heart has all sorts of stuff happening. There's driven by desires and envies and all sorts of things I didn't even know were there. But it also is kind of revealing some of the mental models that get unnoticed in the midst of the craziness of life. I have either of you ever seen the selective attention? They always do these like selective attention types of, the invisible, gorilla, that sort of thing, right? With the different, So I think about that analogy. And if for those who are listening, if you're not familiar with what I'm describing, basically a couple of psychologists would just do a selective attention test where they would have you count the number of times a team would pass a basketball. And then at the very end, they would say, great, awesome, how many times? And you give your number. And then they said, but did you see the gorilla? And 50% of the people, I was one of the 50%, who would watch it, didn't see the gorilla that would walk right in the middle of the circle and beat its chest, roar, and walk out. And you go, wait a minute, that's a true reality happening, yet I didn't see it. I wasn't, my eyes were not attuned to it. But now that I've seen it, I won't miss it. And they called it attentional blindness. And so I think that one of the things that we've had in this is our attentional blindness might have gotten exposed, or we might be seeing things for the first time in ways that we didn't have because of that reactivity and busyness that we were functioning in.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so this makes me think two things that I want to talk about. So one of them is kind of germane to the whole pandemic thing. So I'll talk about that one first. But I want to remember that I've got a second one that's about that you guys are making me think about. That's kind of like doesn't have anything to do with the lockdown stuff. So have you guys ever heard of Duncan Trussell, the comedian? Does that name sound familiar? So we've got this.
Yeah, it does. No, it does. But I don't know whatever you're about to say. I probably don't know it.
He's got a series on Netflix right now called The Midnight Gospel. That's super interesting. He's got a podcast. He's a comedian and super interesting guy. So somebody sent me a clip of him talking about his own anxiety during the lockdown period. And one of the things he was talking about was how, he doesn't know how toilet paper gets to his house. And he's like, so that I used to not have to know, but now it doesn't. And if it's going to ever again, I have to figure out how it's going to happen. And so it's like, so there is like an overload thing that can happen when everything in your life becomes a system 2 problem. I think for a lot of people, one of the things that your operating system will tell you might be a good thing to do is to have a breakdown, because you need the operating system to go through a hard reset because there's too much conflict, too much messed up stuff. So another interesting thinker, do you guys know the rapper Killer Mike?
Yeah.
Super interesting guy, I think, so I heard an interview with Killer Mike talking about, like what to do, what should we do? How should we respond to the pandemic? And one of the things he said was figure out how to grow tomatoes, figure out how to grow some wheat. And I was kind of thinking about that. So I have a lot of respect for the depth of his thought. So my expectation was there was a lot to that comment, thinking about what he might mean there. And I was like, so this is a little conjecture on my part. I don't think he's saying you need to figure out how to feed yourself with what you can grow. But I think if you put what he was saying together with what Duncan Trussell was saying is that, so when all of a sudden everything is a type 2 is a system 2 problem, if you prove to yourself, if you can show yourself at least a little bit that you can figure out how to get food, you can figure out how to clean your own water, you can figure out how to do some basic stuff like that, how to locate some toilet paper, then it gives yourself the permission to move out of that crisis mode, which, you got to figure that out. You can't live in crisis mode all the time, So anyway, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that was, an interesting kind of perspective on that. But, but here's the thing that doesn't really have anything to do with the pandemic stuff. So thinking about this, and kind of like putting the mindfulness element into it too. I feel like there are people that I know who I've had, like, in some cases I have like very close relationships with them. And I cannot relate with them. And one of the things, so when I think about heuristics and mental models, and I think about this idea between, like deep thinking versus like kind of the automatic, the mental model thinking, there are some people who I know who I think do not have the ability, at least not very often, to get into system 2. And I think it's one of the reasons why I cannot relate with them. And I also feel like those same people, because again, people I know pretty well, I can observe in them that they get into situations where they get real stuck with other people too, and they cannot get on the same wavelength as the other person. Everybody has that sometimes, but there's some people I know who, and maybe it's just, but basically, like, the inability to get into system 2, maybe in a particular area, means no hope of connection. What do you guys think about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, to me, that makes a lot of sense. And my first thought was, I'm at a disadvantage because I haven't read that book. So I could be misinterpreting or misapplying something. Correct me if I do. But my thought is, folks in more of that system 1, type 1 thinking, very well, when working with folks counseling wise, I would say probably I've seen trauma survivors, people who've experienced a lot of trauma, can only almost function there. They're one. Yeah. And yes, absolutely. Because they're living from their survival brain, and the survival brain only makes things typically black and white. It makes things, you live out of the limbic, and you're kind of get stuck in a flood often of emotions, and you're hyper vigilant. You're scanning the world often for good versus evil. And so a lot of times I would say that my folks in that experience a lot of trauma are going to be stuck there. That you're right, they won't even be able to get to that. They can't be self-reflective because there's something there's been a brain injury. It doesn't mean that they're stuck there forever. There can be healing and growth. The brain is neuroplastic, it can change. There's new pathways that can be developed. But that is, I would say, a working hypothesis that I would have, and if I were to notice that in a relationship, is say, I actually wonder what their story is. And I wonder what has actually shaped this kind of almost frozen black and white rigidity that doesn't lend itself to self-reflection. So that'd be my first kind of working hypothesis. But I don't know about what do you think, Lucas?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I also think those people, it's because they've been victims in the past, mm-hmm. true victims of something, severe or not as severe, maybe something going on under the surface. It's easy to feel like a victim in the future. And it reminds me of this mental model, Hanlon's razor, which I'm going to mess up the actual wording, but it's don't attribute to malice what can be explained with stupidity. And it's not stupidity in the this person's stupid type sense. It's just saying, like, those people that you constantly butt heads with, and certainly I've been in this position myself, is thinking, man, this person doesn't like me, or this person did that because one reason or another. The vast majority of the time, they don't think about you that much. Right. You don't own that much real estate in their head, and they're probably not doing something to hurt you or just butting heads with you because they don't like you. It's probably just they don't know that you're trying to go deep and they don't really want to. Or I find most of the time it's my misunderstanding of their intentions and their point of view that leads me to be like, this person just can't connect. They're without hope. They can't go this deep. So I think it's just an interesting place to be, because I find that so frustrating as well. It's usually my end. There's a lot of work to be done as well there.
It's I feel like this quote has been attributed to Winston Churchill, which means it probably wasn't said by him. So I can't remember exactly how it goes, but it's something along the lines of, when I was 20, I felt I was always worried about what other people thought about me. When I was 40, I didn't really care what other people thought about me. When I was 60, I realized that no one ever thought about me.
So true.
Yeah,
My brother-in-law, when I play video games against him, and he's just whooping me, he'll always just say, I got free of real estate in your head right now. He's like, it's so funny.
That's awesome. Yeah. And it is, it's interesting to think of, because you think about epistemology or heuristics, it's like, it's kind of like I feel like it's kind of like the alpha male discipline in philosophy. It's like, like the heuristics guys are the football team, like the ethicists are like like the bowling team. You know what I mean? But when you think about it in terms of kind of like the overlap with your emotional life or your psychological life, like there's definitely it's not just about like being a logician. It's not just about like mental experiments or the math involved. Like there's some like eminently practical stuff about just getting along with people that goes along with understanding like how you make snap judgments, and then also how you like get yourself to kind of like deeper levels of understanding too. And I think it's interesting to think about how mindfulness relates with all this kind of stuff, because kind of like to Daniel's point too, like if you don't give yourself opportunities to be quiet enough to let the truth about what goes on inside of yourself bubble up to the surface in a way that you can become like cognizant of, then you definitely have no hope of ever being able to kind of like get out of these grooves that you're in, and that's the kind of thing that I think about all the time. I always think like, man, I need to be like, meditating every morning. But damn it, if I'm not in some grooves that keep me from meditating every morning.
Yeah. And then you throw in the science of habits, right? Of how even our habit formation it just takes time. And the way our brain, I was listening to it was an NPR, I think it's called The Hidden Brain. That was the episode, or the title of the show. And it was the one on habits. And I loved it. I've actually given it to people in a counseling setting before to say, because I often work with people of faith, coming from a Christian perspective. And so one of the things that I've actually attempted to do is almost demoralize some habits and try to put them in a different context. Because actually, if it becomes driven by shame, it almost crushes you at the beginning. So it's kind of like another way in, so to speak. But anyway, the point is you start talking about habit formation too. It's like, like meditation, mindfulness is, there's things that are blocking me. I wonder what it is that's blocking me. What is it in my own, like, there's something going on inside of me. And that's what it was. You mentioned something I wanted to come back to. So sorry, I'm ADDing a little bit, but you said the truth of what's going on in me, something to that effect. And I just thought to myself, I was like, so that's just what I feel like the subtext of kind of what we're talking about when it comes to epistemology is, how do I know what I know? And how do I know I've made contact with what is true reality? And so when you made that statement about kind of the truth about what's happening, I'm going, that was an epistemological statement. There's a kind of framework in which you're saying, I know there's a truth, and I know I want to make contact with it. The question is, how do I make space to be able to make contact with that truth and discover more of it and lead a life that enables me to flourish in it? And so I just almost want to be like, hey, we just did it. We just did what I think we're talking about, just very organically.
So Daniel, how do you get there? Like, let's say I've made the commitment to sit in a room alone by myself and throw the cabinets on the floor and start sorting through these things. What do you think the best approach is to start reorganize and finding out what is true? Like, how do I decide what framework to use and that it's reliable?
Yeah, man, that is an excellent question. And of course, the moment I enter into that, I'm realizing just my own presuppositions in it, right? Of my own mental model.
Right.
But because my faith convictions inform how I put together how I would answer that question. So I just want to be transparent with that. But maybe even starting on a more basic step, if someone's listening right now going, okay, how would I even go about doing this? I actually think I've often challenged people, if you just even take a little bit of time, try 5-10 minutes and get really quiet. Just try it. Just try it just for fun as an experiment. And here's what I want you to just do. Your only job is to start noticing what happens. Noticing where your mind is going, noticing what's going on in your body, where you're experiencing what you're experiencing. Now, the reason I'd want to start there is because I actually think that there's a valid way of knowing truth by what our body is even telling us. And so I think there's often invitations that are going on inside of us that they're invitations to know something deeper. And so I actually think that awareness is that first stage. You actually have to just start with that noticing and being aware before you can take a next step to interpret and make sense of that. And that's where I think when you start interpreting and trying to make sense, that's when you are going to start intuitively using a mental model. And then I think maybe we should talk about, how do you decide what mental model is the best one to use, which is a pretty big, feel like a pretty big conversation. But I don't know, do you feel like I answered the question?
Yeah, I do. And it's an interesting thought that before you get to work, it's almost like taking inventory.
Yeah.
Like you need to sit there and take inventory on where am I at now? What do I believe? What am I noticing about myself? Before you can start like laying the groundwork for a new model or maybe a renovation, like you're saying, not necessarily everyone needs to flip their lives upside down and change something. It could be tweak around the edges. So it's interesting.
Yeah. And here's the other thing too, I would say sometimes our mental models are changing subtly, but we don't realize it until we slow down and we actually make contact with something in our external world that reveals and exposes that something shifted inside of us. And so I would even say there's, I'm just going to think of an example. Okay, because this one, in my Christian kind of traditions, people have different perspectives on people's roles in ministry. And one of the things I remember talking with a friend about is how all of a sudden one day they woke up, so to speak, and realized that they had totally shifted. They had totally shifted their mental model. Now, what had really happened was over time, there were multiple things happening. They were growing in their own understanding of certain things that they thought, the Bible was teaching, but also the voices that they were listening to outside were changing. They were being influenced in different directions, and the authority structures, they were willing to listen to other voices. And so one day, it wasn't one day, something that I would say they had already taken a journey. They'd kind of taken a pledge of faith, so to speak, and they were walking out and they one day discovered something that was already kind of in process. So anyway, I just think that's also,
gradually, then all of a sudden,
exactly. Yeah. That's it. That's beautiful.
That reminds me of that book, the Thomas Kuhn book, the about scientific revolutions. The book that the phrase paradigm shift came from.
No, yeah.
I'm not familiar with the book, but I'm very familiar with the term.
Yeah. Right. Well, so and that's basically like what that book. That's another philosopher. That's what that book is about. It's about the idea that So when you think about, when we all learn history, and then when we all think about our own history, we think about it like this. Like it's this kind of like this linear progression, and maybe sometimes there's like bumps, and so you've got World War or Genghis Khan or but it's like the reality is you have like this like very, very chaotic sort of story that gets smoothed out in the rearview mirror, and I think that's true too. But also for me, thinking about this idea too of like the kind of like the trying to kind of even tune into the operating system that's running already. My own experience is that when I've had periods of time where I get like intensely interested in like, okay, I got to figure out like the right way to conceive of the world, the right way to conceive of my life. I have to figure out like the right game plan for my career or for how I'm going to raise these kids or, whatever. I have this idea that like, I'm going to kind of like do battle with like the great thoughts of, you know, human history. And I'm going to like sift through these ideas. But then whenever I have these moments where maybe I do have some opportunity to get to like tune into what's actually going on in me, the stuff that actually is kind of like the heavy stuff is like, you know, you do not like yourself. You do not feel like you are worthy of security or safety or maybe even more.
Mm-hmm.
You know beyond a shadow of the doubt that your life will ultimately be disappointing to you and the people that know you. Like for me, those have been some of the things that like, you know, I've had, you know, thankfully I've had opportunities where I've gotten to kind of like hear that, you know, and be like, damn, you know. And it's kind of like the Carl Jung quote that, you know, everyone is living out a myth. And it would be a really good idea for you to figure out, you know, what that myth is, because it might be one that has a tragic ending. And it'd be nice if you could figure it out and start to do something about it now rather than when the end.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I think that's 100% true, you know, and I still love the, like, you know, the kind of like the, you know, the I don't know what the right word for it is, but like it's a fun job to kind of think about those structures. But I think also sometimes like getting super into like, well, am I, you know, like, you know, would I like side with a, you know, philosopher A or philosopher B or thinker A or thinker B?
Right.
That's fun to think about, but like ultimately, if it's like, you know, yeah, I mean, who cares? Because I don't like myself, and I'm trying really hard to distract myself from that reality.
Right.
That's something I should probably figure out too, you know?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
A similar quote to that is another Charlie Munger ism, where he said, "I just want to know where I'm going to die, so I don't go there."
Yeah. He is great. I think somebody will probably write a book of aphorisms or just like from him, you know, one of these days. He
Has
would
to.
put any money in it, I'm sure.
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah. It's interesting, you know, I feel like, you know, hearing what you shared, Josh, I'm thinking, you know, so often we like to think of epistemology, and I even kind of think about some of the great minds that would probably, I mean, I think circles around me. I couldn't even hold their coattails, so to speak. And yet, if you get them in a room and you start tinkering, you realize that all of us have to construct a mental model to answer some fundamental questions. And I really think that in part, there's this interpersonal, like relational dynamic that shapes our brain. One psychologist, he calls it interpersonal neurobiology. And basically it's just like, hey, our brain's a relational organ, and it itself is shaped by our relational dynamics, and in our programming and the way we think is actually so fundamentally constructed by how we experience love and connection.
Yeah.
And so you now add that in, and it's not just we're sitting in a room constructing on these wonderful, you know, pontificating these wonderful thoughts and big, you know, $3 words. It's like, no, something deep down inside me is gnawing at me and go, I need to know that I'm loved. Your brain needs that in order for it to really thrive. And so I just love how you were able to highlight that, yeah, some of those, I think, truths embedded in that system too that we need to attend to, our very systems are, like, helpfully so, are going to try to fight us going there, because man, that's hard to try to sit in that and go, am I really lovable? Like if I stop the hustle, people are going to actually accept me just for, like, because I am. Like, whoa, that's existentially naked. So let's not stop there. You know?
I'd much rather have a bank account or a resume that they could be attracted to, you know?
Yeah.
Just this, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
And I think I'd venture to say that, especially as you're doing like this mental reorganization, if you don't get down that deep, and you still have those bad intentions, like let's say one of your shifts was you wanted to spend your free time with a side hustle to generate more income for your family, whatever. That was on my mind a little bit. if it's rooted in the fact that like I'm not worthy unless I have more money than my neighbor, it will end up ultimately failing you, because then you're gonna make more money than your neighbor, or fail. Maybe you fail in the first place, or maybe you make more money than your neighbor, and then you want to be the richest person on the block, and so on. And it just never, it's never satisfying. So I think to your point, Josh, if you don't take inventory of the not only what you do, but the foundations of why you do what you do, you can still end up in the wrong destination. Like you think you're charting your path for somewhere, but you end up somewhere different because you didn't think about like the true reasons why you do what you do.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. You know, and I think, you know, so this is a little, you know, half-baked Josh theory here. So feel free to tell me that I'm wrong, but what I would say, so here's the good news. So Daniel's right. Like you need to have that sense of like, of you know, purpose, worthiness, you know, like, you know, being worthy of love. But what I would actually posit is that if you don't have that, one of two things will happen. Your insides will either wither or they will revolt. And there aren't any other options in those two. So basically, like, you cannot go on, you know, ad infinitum without getting that kind of like that purpose and meaning question answered, because eventually what will happen is you will die or you will protest. You know, and that's actually good news. You know, and it's counterproductive, but it's an example of the Leonard Cohen situation where you need a crack to let the light in, you know. So if you don't know where the light is, then you know, it'll crack. Things will crack on their own. And that kind of gets us back, you know, to where we started, you know, because that's kind of in the sense like what happened in this situation. It was like some cracking. And one of the things I think is super interesting that I kind of hope will be part of the story of this experience is that, so if you, like, so many people have compared this to 2008 and 2009, you know, to the, just in terms of like the economic, I hear a lot of that because of the business that I'm in. But one of the things that I think is interesting about this is that, you know, like in 2008 and 2009, we could say who did it. We could say who was wrong. And there was like great relief in that, you know, and it also was like an organizing principle that could help you like get the opportunity to feel righteous and pious and pissed off and holy. This time, now people are still looking for it. Every time somebody tells me that my mask is on wrong, I feel them looking for it, you know. But the reality is that, and I think most of, you know, just about everybody recognizes this, like this is in a lot of ways, it's just a thing that happened. And there is some stuff that could have happened differently. We could have done differently. We'll be hopefully more prepared next time. But that in itself is a gift too, because it gives us a chance to kind of like, we have to do business with some stuff. We don't have the distraction of a boogeyman who leveraged their bank, you know, 40 times, and set these dominoes falling down, you know, to point the finger at. So it is like an opportunity to kind of have some of these conversations, do some of this work, and maybe jump the tracks a little bit.
The idea of a scapegoat is what comes to mind. There's a Catholic theologian, he describes it as mimetic theory, as like we all psychologically need something to bear the weight of our internal anxiety, essentially. And so we often look for that, whether it's in a family, you know, the black sheep of the family, whatever. It's like there's something that, because we're actually internally distressed, we have to find a locus and a focus where it goes. And I think even 9/11, I think of a lot of these big events. You're absolutely right. There's no one singular focus where we can land. And so it actually puts us in a spot of having to deal then with our own internal distress, rather than place it somewhere.
Yeah. The Chinese bat lobby is really glad that it didn't land on them, right?
Yeah. No kidding.
Wow.
Yes, there was a few attempts, but
So, well, guys, I really, really appreciate you being willing to have the conversation. I always have lots of fun conversations with you guys, and this one was
totally.
So love what's in your guys' brains, and I love it that you're willing to share it with us.
Absolutely, man. It's good to connect.
Thanks so much. Yeah.
Great chatting.
Thank you guys.
All right.
We'll talk to you all soon.
Thanks, Josh.
Sounds good.
See you guys.